Hi everyone, welcome back to PCS 101. This is for our class for Thursday, the 6th of April, where we are getting ready for our third and final speech, the persuasive speech. So in terms of speech number 2, if you submitted in your outline on time, you would have received feedback from me. For those of you who did not submit in your outline on time, I am reviewing those speeches now. As you know, you need to have an outline in order to have your speech evaluated. And I'm hopeful that speech number 1 and speech number 2 have served as good preparation for our final speech, which happens to be the persuasive speech. And I just wanted to go through a few dates with you because, believe it or not, we are headed towards the ending of the semester. So next class, which is the 13th of April, we will have our third quiz, very similar to what we did with quiz number 1 and quiz number 2. It'll be 20 questions, mostly short answer, but some multiple choice and true false, open book, open notes. And I will also have you view a sample student persuasive speech. And then the class after that, which is April 20th, of course, a Thursday, that's when your third speech will be due, our 15-minute persuasive speech. This is a speech where you are going to try to convince us to take a particular action, or perhaps to support a policy, or perhaps both. And you are asked to use 3 outside references. Some of you already used outside references for speech number 2, but you are required to use outside references for speech number 3. And I'm going to request that you indicate what those references are in your speaking outline at the bottom of the outline so that I can review those references. Of course, in the real world, you wouldn't necessarily be sharing your speaking outline or your references with your audience, but you should be prepared to offer your audience the information about your references. We had talked a little bit about using outside resources in previous class in the event that you thought you might want to incorporate them into the second speech. Not that you would necessarily have to, but now you definitely do have to incorporate them into the third speech. You can use as many resources as you like. I stopped counting after 3. You can use whatever combination you would like. So you could use 3 websites if you so decided to. Of course, if you were giving a longer speech, you would want to have a variety of different kinds of sources, some print and electronic to balance each other out. And in terms of how you cite those sources on your outline, since you're not writing a formal academic paper, you don't have to cite those sources in any particular format. As you know, in English and the humanities, we use the MLA, Modern Language Association. In the sciences, we use the APA, the American Psychological Association. But again, you don't have to list them in any particular format. I want your speeches to be something that would be useful in the real world. So in the real world, if an audience member were to ask you for your resources, they would probably want just general information such as author and title and place of publication and publisher, things of that nature. So in terms of outside sources, I had indicated that you probably want to spend some time on the GCC Library website because they have wonderful resources that are through their databases that have been vetted. So they've been reviewed by experts. So there's a certain level of authenticity that we can rely upon with databases that you might not necessarily be able to rely upon in the open net. Not that I'm in any way against using the internet. You just need to be cautious when you're using the internet and make sure that you're getting correct information. And as much as the internet has taken over our lives, obviously you can still use print resources, even interviews, as I had talked about when we were discussing using outside resources. And the trick when you're delivering your speech is just to be very clear as to when you are sharing information from a resource that is not yourself. And you can do that very simply with just using a tag, for instance, like according to experts or whatever the case may happen to be. So That said, that puts us into April 27th, where we will have our fourth and final quiz. If you haven't already figured it out, that what happens after you post your speech is a week later, I will ask you to review the speeches of your classmates and to send me via email, so it's private, one strength and one weakness of each of your classmates' speeches, and then I compile all of that and I share that with you. So that's what I'm going to be asking you to do today for your attendance question in lieu of a discussion forum question. I'm going to ask you to review all of your peer speeches for speech number 2 and to send me a strength and weakness via email. And when we get to our fourth and final quiz on the 27th, that's what you would be doing during that class as well, is you would be reviewing speech number 3, the persuasive speech from your classmates, and sending me a strength and a weakness. And what that would mean is that I could post those strengths and weaknesses the following week, which I have listed as a catch-up class. That's the 4th of May. If all goes well, the only obligation you would have for that class is just to read the feedback that I would have compiled from all of you about strengths and weaknesses about your classmates' speeches. And that would be it for this semester. In terms of the quizzes, keep in mind there are 4 quizzes over the course of the semester, and I dropped the lowest grade so that if it turns out that you missed a quiz or you performed poorly on a quiz, that would be the grade that I dropped. If you take the first 3 quizzes and you are content with your grades, you can elect to not take the 4th quiz. So that's a bit of a reward if you so wanted. So that gives you an idea of what's coming up. But if you look at the notes below, you'll see that it begins with talking about registration, which if you are watching this video on Thursday, the 6th, registration is now open for returning students. And I encourage you to register sooner rather than later so you can get exactly what you want in terms of times, in terms of teachers, in terms of subject matter. And you can see that I included a link for registration where you can find the online catalog. But really all you can do, or the electronic schedule of classes, I should say. But really all you need to do is to go onto the GCC website and it'll direct you to that as well. You'll see that we're listing classes both for the summer sessions, summer session 1, summer session 2, as well as for the fall. And you can do all kinds of electronic searches to narrow down the hits that you get. So you could search based on subject, based on teacher, based on time, based on teaching modality. And of course, the more parameters that you add in, the narrower your search. Summer session classes, if you've never taken one, they're highly condensed. Basically, they meet for about half of what we would normally meet for in an academic semester. But the distinction is that the same amount of work is done, but just in half the time. So that said, it doesn't necessarily appeal to everyone, but it does appeal to a certain group of students. So if you're looking to increase the speed at which you are completing your GCC requirements, that could be an option for you. I found, because I teach in the summer session, that the classes are smaller. The students are usually quite serious. They would have to be if they were taking classes in the summer. What you'll notice about the summer session is that staffing has not been inserted yet, but at least I can share with you what I would be teaching this summer session. First summer session, I am teaching English 247. That happens to be a Women in Literature class. And it's online, and it would be conducted much like this class. And the second summer session, I am teaching a public speaking class, basically this class. Also, you'll notice that in the fall schedule of classes, while most of the classes are staffed, some are not, including CMN 201, which is Horror Film and Media and Popular Culture. I might have mentioned this class to you before. This is my class. I'm very interested in horror film. So even though my name isn't listed there yet, it will be. And it is it is an online class this time around. Sorry. I teach it online in the fall and in person in the spring. And If you are curious to know more about this class, which talks a little bit about some of the anxieties of our times that are illustrated within horror films from particular genres, particularly in regards to things like racism and classism and sexism. If you have questions about the course, you can certainly ask me, but I also put together a brief trailer of the class, and you can see in our notes below that if you wanted to view it, it's on YouTube, and it'll give you an overview of the course as well. So, in terms of where we are is preparing for our persuasive speech. 15 minutes, the longest speech, probably the most challenging speech. I've always said that the persuasive speech, the trick is not to have everybody agree with you. The trick is to earn everyone's respect. Those are two different things. It's quite possible that you can have audience members that disagree with your position, but they can still respect that you put together a good speech. So that's really what you're aiming for. And you'll probably have 3 groups within your audience. One group already agrees with your position before you even begin your speech. And you want to make sure that they still continue to agree with your position by the time you end your speech. There's another group, the exact extreme opposite, where it doesn't matter what you say or do, they will never agree with you. That their beliefs are so firmly embedded, there's nothing you can do to change that. And then there's the middle group. Perhaps you might call them the swing group. That's oftentimes how they're referenced in politics. That they're on the fence. They could go either way. That's the group you're really appealing to, or at least trying to plant some seeds, because you may not necessarily be able to persuade them in the moment, but perhaps you have suggested ideas that they could think about over the course of time. Now, your job is to contact me prior to the 19th, or I'm sorry, prior to the date of your speech, and that happens to be on April 20th. So contact me prior to April 20th about what you're planning on doing for speech number 3, much like you've done with speech number 2 and with speech number 1. You need to talk about a topic that can be debated, something that reasonable people could disagree about, something that's more than just a fact. And refute the opposing side if at all possible. That said, you don't want to lose control of your speech so that you are now talking about the opposite position. But don't ignore, as I call it, the elephant in the room, that if there is an obvious alternate position, better to just address it and indicate why that perspective is not as strong as the perspective you're putting forth than pretending as if there were no other positions. Now, how to choose your topic. Now, you might decide that there was something that you discussed in your first and or second speech that you could elaborate upon. So, for instance, your first speech might have been how you are, let's say, a fan of baseball. And then your second speech might have been an informative speech about how baseball was invented. And then your third speech could be to try to convince the audience that we should have a baseball team, sports team at GCC. So you can see how all 3 speeches are connected in that way. Not that they would have to be. And in terms of the persuasive speech, you might want to think about other classes that you've taken, much like you did with perhaps the informative speech. There might have been a paper that you've written where you needed to take a position on a controversial topic that you could adapt for your persuasive speech. Think about the topics that you oftentimes discuss at holidays or just on a daily basis. So think about the news, because the news oftentimes provides you with lots of fodder for persuasive topics. And I guess the question is, how controversial do you want to get? And that's your personal decision. You can get quite controversial. We are well aware of the hot button topics in our society. They oftentimes are debated politically, oftentimes debated poorly politically. And the idea is that if we can't talk about controversial topics in academia, I don't know where we can talk about controversial topics. So yes, things like gun control and abortion, all of those hot button topics are possibilities. Again, you want to do it in a respectful manner to your audience. You don't need to be controversial, though, if you don't necessarily feel like being controversial. I've heard many a speech that really has little or no controversy associated with it. For instance, I've heard many speeches about improving diet and increasing exercise. Just about everybody would agree with that. The difficulty with that kind of speech is not to have us to agree with the position, but to have us change our behavior. It's one thing to say eat better, but it's another to actually get people to actually implement that. So sometimes it's easier to convince somebody to take an action. Sometimes it's easier to convince somebody to take a position. Depends on the subject. So, for instance, I might convince you to sign a petition, and that may or may not necessarily reflect your belief system. You might just sign that petition because you think it would be a good PR opportunity, or you're hoping that you won't be pestered anymore. Or I could have you change an opinion. And again, I think most people would agree that yes, we should eat better and we should exercise, but taking the action can be quite complex. So again, it depends on your topic. So think a little bit, and of course we can discuss this during what I'm calling our practice sessions, when I ask each of you to reach out to me. It can be very informal, just through email if you'd like, about what you're thinking about your speech. Or you could actually deliver your speech via Zoom with me if you so wanted, and I could give you feedback before you actually record it. Outside sources, they enhance credibility. It's one of the reasons why I'm asking you to use outside sources. And there are whole studies devoted to the idea of how to motivate individuals to change behavior, to change beliefs. This is just a very brief overview. Motivational appeals. What tends to motivate individuals? The most simplistic of levels, there are three things. One is affiliation or belonging. People want to belong to the group. The second is achievement or success. People want to have a certain level of success in their lives. And the third is power. People want to have a certain level of control in their lives. Advertisements will oftentimes utilize these motivational appeals to try to get you to purchase product. Think about cars, for instance, affiliation or belonging. And the idea is that this is perhaps the number one vehicle in America. You want to be part of the group. You want to be part of the number one. Or achievement success, where oftentimes luxury cars are sold in this way, that if you are driving a particular brand, then probably you're dressed in a particular way and your destination is probably to a rather impressive home. The idea is that if you can purchase this luxury brand car, then chances are you have the lifestyle that goes with it. Or power control. And again, cars will do this very frequently. The idea is that you may not necessarily have power control over your job or your personal life, but you can control your car because it's your environment. You can roll up the windows, blast the radio, climate control, and the whole thing. Usually these commercials show a car driving down a deserted highway or freeway, and of course that isn't necessarily the reality for most drivers. Perhaps it's the reality in Western Mass, where there's less traffic and where there are lots of trees, but certainly in urban areas that isn't the case. And the car is probably the most expensive product you'll buy outside of a home or an education. So that's why I'm using that as an example. But this works just as well for mouthwash in some respects. You want to belong, so certainly you don't want to be ostracized because you've got bad breath. So the idea is that if you use this mouthwash, then you will be part of the group and you won't be excluded. So there was a theorist named Monroe, and he came up with a motivated sequence of what gets people to perform a particular behavior to support a particular position. And really, it's quite commonsensical. I think we've been talking about this all semester long. First, you need to get your audience's attention. And then you need to establish a need. If you're going to try to persuade us of something, you're going to have to indicate to us what it is that needs to be changed. And then you are going to give us an option for satisfying that need, or at least to begin to satisfy that need. Then visualizations, so that we can get a true understanding of how that would work in reality. And then if it turns out that you wanted your audience to take some kind of action, you could do so. So what you're doing is putting forth an argument. So when we talk about arguments in college classes, we're talking about making a claim. and providing evidence to support that claim. And there's some sort of reasoning pattern that is utilized. Now, there are lots of different claims that you can make. You can make a claim of fact, but even claims of fact can be debated. Take something like GCC is a small school. That's a claim of fact. But by what comparison? When you're saying something is or is not. GCC is a small school in comparison to what? I've had students claim that GCC is quite a large school in comparison to previous schools they've attended. So it depends what your comparison is. A claim of value, that something is good or bad, and that can be quite subjective. GCC is a good school. And the question is measurement. How do you measure that? Is it graduation rates? Is it student feedback? Or a claim of policy that a particular action should be taken. Perhaps, as I suggested earlier, GCC should reestablish a sports program. We used to have one. It was eliminated because of budgetary concerns, and we could debate back and forth whether that was a wise budgetary decision. Could it have been an unwise decision, because if we had a sports program, would we be able to attract more students, hence earn more tuition dollars? And again, we don't know unless we actually put it into practice. The reasoning patterns that you use, there are lots of options as well. Inductive reasoning, in other words, you use multiple examples in order to draw a particular conclusion. Medical studies are a great example, where you study over and over again the effects of a certain pharmaceutical to try to make a determination. But as you know, medical studies have made errors in the past. So inductive reasoning doesn't always work. Deductive reasoning is that you make a generalization. And I suspect that most of us have deduced that college leads to a certain level of success, or we wouldn't be involved in academia. And that's usually the case, that college leads to success, but not necessarily always the case. And success can sometimes be achieved without college. Reasoning from signs, some sort of observable mark. So for instance, if you have a sore throat, that could be the sign to you that you are getting a head cold. And the reason you can do this is because you induce, through all of the examples that have happened in the past, that whenever you get a sore throat, the end result, you can generalize, deduce that meant that you were getting ill. So errors in reasoning are quite common. They occur all the time. We all engage in them. What you want to do is to try to be aware of them so that you avoid them when you are putting together an argument, when you are putting together your persuasive speech. And you also want to be aware of them when you are listening to the arguments of others or consuming persuasive speeches. And I could spend an entire semester talking about different errors, but here are just a few. A hasty generalization, that there's too little evidence for you to be able to draw a conclusion. I had just said that registration is beginning, and very soon we will see what the registration numbers look like, and we, or at least the college, will have to make decisions about whether or not to keep a class open or to cancel it because of low enrollment. And the question always is this a hasty generalization? That just because this class didn't fill last semester and it looks like it's not filling this semester, does that mean that this is not a popular class? Or are there other variables at play? The teacher, the time, not necessarily the course. The appeal to ignorance, what we don't know. In other words, prove me wrong. So I maintain I'm a space alien, and I am until you show me that I'm not. Again, the burden of proof is supposed to be on the person who's presenting the argument, not on the person who's consuming the argument. The bandwagon fallacy, join the crowd. I call this the teenager argument, that just because everybody else is doing it, you want to do it as well. The sequential fallacy, that cause and effect are connected, that what comes first influences what comes next. So if you were feeling unwell, let's say, and you performed poorly on the quiz, you make the connection that you were sick, therefore you performed poorly. However, perhaps you've been performing poorly on quizzes throughout the entire semester. It has absolutely nothing to do with your state of health. So there isn't necessarily a direct correlation always between cause and effect. One thing I have noticed in terms of politics, if things are going well, that politician will take the credit. If things are going poorly, that politician will blame outside sources. That's almost universal, I think, in the political world. Begging the question is just rephrasing the question. It's circular reasoning. So, what is critical thinking? It's thinking critically. Is a great example of begging the question. You just rephrase the question. Or what is empathic listening? It's listening with empathy. You've just rephrased the question. You haven't defined what empathy is. And these are two questions that were on our previous quizzes. I'm quite aware of that. The appeal to authority, it sounds like it has a certain level of validity because it's a celebrity endorsement. But this particular celebrity doesn't necessarily have expertise in what they're endorsing. They merely have popularity. We oftentimes will see this with actors and musicians who are endorsing products that have absolutely nothing to do with acting or with music. The idea is that we are fans of these actors or musicians and we want to emulate them. So therefore we would be persuaded to engage in their purchasing behaviors, even though they don't necessarily have any particular expertise in that particular purchase. The name calling, attacking an individual, and I think we talk about this in elementary school. It's kind of like the schoolyard arguments that you're not supposed to call people names. I see this happen very frequently in the political realm, where now, for some reason, it seems that political parties have become slur words and curse words. Democrat and Republican, liberal and conservative. It wasn't like this when I was younger, by the way, but it's like this now. A genetic fallacy that you continue past practice purely because it's past practice. If this happens very frequently in the workplace, if you ask a question, why are we doing this? And the response is, well, we've always done it this way. That's not necessarily a good reason for doing something. That just shows that there's precedent, but that doesn't necessarily show that there's validity. So, in terms of all of these errors in reasoning, there was a video that I wanted you to see. And there's also an article that I wanted you to read. So if you go down to the 4th section under errors in reasoning, you'll see that there's an article from Diverse Education. And it talks about a situation that happened several years ago that I think is a wonderful example of errors in reasoning. And very briefly, it was about two college debate teams that were competing against one another. And debate teams basically are teams that put forth arguments and they compete against one another. And then there are a panel of judges, usually from both universities, that evaluate the presentations and then make a decision as to the winner. So things got pretty heated in this particular competition. And it wasn't between the debate teams, it was between the debate coaches. Now, you would expect that the debate coaches, who basically are professors who do this for a living in communications, would know better. But this is a great illustration of how emotion can get in the way of intellect. And there's a whole backstory to this. Basically, these were two coaches from two different universities that had some bad blood between them. One was male, one was female, one is white, one is black. The debate that they were engaged in happened to be about race relations, so it was already very heated. And it had something to do with the calculation of points. When you strike out an opponent, meaning not literally hitting somebody, but this is when you evaluate them as a judge to try to determine whether or not their argument is valid. And what ended up happening is that they got into an argument, these two debate coaches, in front of their students and in front of other professors, where it descended into not just name calling, but slurs, profanity. And one professor, the male, lowered his pants and mooned the other professor, who's female. He was wearing underwear, however, so I guess we could debate as to whether or not that's a true mooning or not. So, all of this should have occurred privately. This was not supposed to be recorded, but let this be a lesson to you. In our age of technology, everything is recorded nowadays. So somebody recorded it and they posted it online, and it went viral. And the result was that one professor was fired, the male professor who had engaged in the quote mooning, unquote. The other professor was put on probation. Now, we can decide, about whether or not we agree or disagree with the punishments and what led to those punishments. And I'm not that concerned about the backstory or who's right or who's wrong or anything of that nature. I wanted you to see this to illustrate how easy it is to lose control when emotion gets in the way of intellect. That it's very easy to engage in lots of errors in reasoning, and you will see name calling amongst lots of other errors in reasoning as well. So think of this as a cautionary tale about not allowing your emotion to get in the way of your intellect. The way the story is that both professors have tried very hard to have this video removed from the internet, but it keeps popping up, and at least as of my making of this taping, I've been able to find a snippet of what the altercation was about, which ultimately resulted in actually one student bursting into tears. You're not going to see the whole altercation, or do you? I think I've proven my point, which is the first few minutes that you'll see about how quickly this descended from two professionals who know better. So, in terms of where we are now, is that you should be contacting me before the 20th of April for speech number 3. And also you should be viewing the speeches of your classmates, speech number 2. That would be due the way our attendance questions are due, 48 hours from Thursday. So that would be Saturday on the 8th at 6 p.m. But as always, if you need additional time, please let me know. And I'll be happy to grant you an extension. Just send me one strength and one weakness of each of your classmates' speeches. I will compile all that data, and then I will post that in our next class, as well as a sample persuasive speech and quiz number 3. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.